Hello again, and thank you for joining us for part 3 of an ethics overview for peer support specialists. I'm Carla Neely, and Foley Nash and I will be presenting this information today. In parts 1 and 2, we've covered our confidentiality disclosures, our biographies, and the learning objectives for this final part of the presentation will cover common ethical challenges and approaches to addressing them.
In earlier parts of our presentation, part 1 covered the Code of Ethics for Peer Support Specialists, and part 2 focused on the ACA Code's ethical decision-making model. The third and final part of this will discuss, as Carla referenced, the common ethical challenges, and will also include an explanation of the adult learning model at some point. For starters, let's take a look at 2 common ethical pitfalls: transference and countertransference. You can see on the slide a brief description, but we'll go into a little more depth. Those are the emotional reactions, sometimes unconscious ones, that clients and helpers, peer support specialists, counselors, any mental health provider, can have toward each other and to the process itself. Transference involves a client's reaction, usually toward the helper, peer support specialist, and countertransference goes in the other direction, from the helper or peer support specialist toward the client. When you look at transference, that can be based on the client's positive feelings toward you, either because of your characteristics or because maybe you remind them of someone else they have positive feelings toward. Relative, girlfriend, boyfriend, or someone they have either depended on or wanted to depend on. Countertransference can be based on the pleasant experiences you may have had with someone similar to the client, on the client being receptive and easy to work with, or on your personal attraction to the client for other reasons. And as you'll note in the slide, both transference and countertransference can not only be positive, but they can also be negative. So very interesting to consider the negative reactions of transference and countertransference. Another ethical challenge is the relationship itself. For part 1 of this, we would look at boundaries. Are boundary crossings and violations different? Which one would you see as more severe? Is it a question of intent? Would that be determined to be more or less serious by the reaction of the employer or maybe of the consumer? I recently had an experience where a counselor who thought that it was simply a boundary crossing was really surprised to discover that the Board of Examiners found that that was actually a Code of Ethics violation. So very interesting things to consider because there are different perspectives about what those boundaries and their crossings and violations might mean. Dual relationships. There are some factors to consider before getting into a dual or multiple relationship, and certainly worth looking at things that you can do to avoid that slippery slope and how to avoid those kinds of things. Is it okay to be Facebook friends? Is it okay if we go to the same church, have our kids in the same school, if we're neighbors, if we're relatives? As a counselor, I can't counsel someone who is a relative. Then there's also the question of, is this person a relative of a friend or a relative of some significant other? What about workplace connections? All of those kinds of things go into considerations about dual relationships. And about the ethics of all of this, at one time, it was exclusively avoid dual relationships. That was the directive. But more recently, because of the recognition of how hard that is, especially in rural or underserved areas, ethical codes have begun to shift. suggesting that the decision be made on the basis of a cost-benefit analysis. Does the benefit outweigh the risk? What are the pros? What are the cons? So it may be beneficial to consult for a second opinion instead of relying only on your own thoughts. You may also want to consider that the Peer Support Specialist Code of Ethics has a stance that it's taken on dual relationships. Okay, what about checking out a client's Facebook page? As we conclude on that one. Definitely not recommended. And certainly as you look at dual relationships, you want to consider what factors there are in your work or community situation that create some risk for them. And in our next area of relationship issues, we look at dependence challenges. And you have three areas there where something is over important to you, or you may resent a person who is needy or demanding, or if they're angry with you, you can take their anger personally and can also lead to some difficulties there. A lot of times dependence issues are connected to a phenomenon called status role integration. That's a theory that acknowledges how someone's degree of attachment to their role can impact their sense of their status. If the helper role, for example, is too large a part of your sense of self, you could be at risk for being too willing to foster a client's dependence on you and your services, not to mention that there are clients who may already have dependent personality traits. On the other hand, clients you may view as too dependent on you might trigger you to have negative reactions, anger, resentment, intimidation, avoiding. So if there are any clients that come to mind from your current or past work that might present some of these issues, you might want to think about whether you consulted for another opinion, or if you didn't consult, why not? And what might have been the risk if you did not consult? And we have some wonderful social media scenarios here. These are from the American Counseling Association Code, the references underneath each of the scenarios, but they also apply to peer support specialists. Number one, for example, being Facebook friends looks like a deliberate violation from a professional to a personal level of knowledge and blurs the lines. Invitation to a problem. Number two, using social media to advertise looks like an invitation to prospective clients to begin the process themselves of blurring the professional and personal boundary lines. Number three, check on their personal website or their personal Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, whatever, okay? That seems to be a deliberate effort on the part of whoever's doing that to, without permission from the client, get personal information that may not have been what the client wanted to disclose. Not exactly a great aspect of a trusting relationship. And item number four, I struggle with making ethical decisions. Can I take that to a chat room on social media and get some input from other people? That one also invites an ethical problem, because if a case you're describing in order to get peer input or consultation happens to be related or connected to someone in the chat who might recognize them, then you've evaded the confidentiality safeguards that go with a more professional arrangement for consultation. Because at some point, you can't really tell where that information goes once it's out in that way. Three things that are important to be aware of as you consider ethical issues. One is the need to clarify your values and their role in your work. Maybe that's status role integration theory. Number two, the ethics of imposing your values on clients. That's where we need to make sure that the client has autonomy and is in charge of making their own decisions for things, whether they go against our values or not. And then if you have some conflicting values with a client, you have to decide if you're going to refer or not refer, And for all of those, you might want to have your risk management toolkit handy for use and maybe some consultation options as well. Where do the ethical problems come from most of the time? In a study over a 10-year period conducted by the Healthcare Providers Service Organization and published in 2014, they're about due for another one, most professional liability claims, over 2/3, involved face-to-face activity with an individual client. And a little more than half of all of the claims took place in an office-based setting. So just because you're working in an office is not a protection against some ethical problems, or at least allegations of ethical problems. The second one, claims primarily involved adults. That's massive, 92.1%. But child clients through age 17 and under, resulted in an average claim payment almost 3 times more than the payment for an adult. So the reality is that if there's something ethical that creates a problem with a child, there's a perception that that's significantly more serious, even though it's less frequent. And the third area is that the most frequent malpractice allegation of all, almost 40%, was an inappropriate sexual or romantic relationship with a client, their spouse or partner, or a family member. Gives us some food for thought here. And here we're getting into the adult learning model and taking that theory of the adult learning model into process and practice. Because as you're learning or refreshing your heightened sense of ethics, which we hope we're helping to do here, while looking to become more proficient in identifying and solving ethical dilemmas, you're moving through the adult learning model for this new or improved skill set. These next slides describe that process, which applies to all of us. In this one, it was initially referenced as 4 stages for learning any new skill, and the 4 stages of learning provide a model for learning. Individuals are initially unaware of how little they know. As they recognize what they don't know, they begin to acquire a skill and then consciously use it. And then eventually it becomes usable without having to be consciously thought through. And then you've acquired what's called unconscious competence. Several elements, including helping someone know what they don't know or recognize a blind spot, can be compared to some elements of a Johari window. Although Johari deals with self-awareness, while the 4 stages of competence deals with learning stages. In our next slide, we have a little graphic or a depiction of those stages broken down into the different steps, beginning with unconscious incompetence, where there's less understanding. Then there's conscious incompetence, where there's more understanding, but the deficit is recognized. So when you're there, you want to make a few mistakes from time to time, preferably the harmless ones, so that you can learn from those and make progress to the 3rd level, which is conscious competence. And that level requires concentration, and it requires consciousness and focus on executing that new skill. And at the peak, you've had so much practice with that new skill that it's become second nature, it's automatic and internalized, and it can be performed easily. As a result, you can even do that while doing something else. And at that point, you should be able to teach it to others depending on how and when it was learned. So these are the 4 stages or steps in the adult learning model. And the graphic on the next slide gives you a little depiction of that. And as you can see, it goes from the base of unconscious incompetence up through becoming conscious of the incompetence, and then becoming competent by staying conscious and focused. And then once you have everything internalized and naturalized into something you don't have to think about at that point, then it becomes unconscious competence. On the next slide, we have a little comparison of how that applies to self-awareness and personal growth. As you're going through this adult learning model that we were just describing, you learn some things about yourself. What's on this slide is the Johari window, which shows how we gain self-awareness and achieve personal, or in this case, since we're talking about peer support specialists and ethics, professional growth. On the left is a static model. It's in black and white. And the model on the right uses yellow arrows to show the desired direction of growth. We have areas that are open, areas that are hidden because they're unknown by others, even though we know them. And we have areas that are blind, that we don't know about, but other people know. And then we have areas that are unknown to anyone. So the goal in the model on the right, using those yellow arrows, is to make growth in those directions that the arrows are pointing in, so that the eventual goal, which is accomplished with what's on the small blue arrows, either asking things or telling things to help the growth happen, that goal is to have the unknown area, that lower right quadrant 4, become smaller to whatever degree is appropriate and comfortable. And that's a model for our professional growth, and we hope that our ethics presentation has facilitated a little bit of professional and personal growth for everyone participating.
So we want to thank you for joining us for this presentation today. And in closing, we'd like to reiterate the importance of peer support specialists becoming familiar with the Louisiana Peer Support Code of Ethics covered in Part 1 and the ethical decision-making model that we covered in Part 2 of the presentation. We also want to encourage peers to connect with other peers and to take advantage of any networking opportunities that you come across, because that's where you're going to find the consulting help and support to resolve any potential ethical challenges that you may come across. So we want you to take advantages of the references that we've provided, and feel free to contact us with any feedback you think might be helpful. Thank you.